January 1940. A grey winter light settles over Berlin. Inside the Army High Command, maps are pinned flat against the walls. Red and blue arrows trace Europe's borders. Tables list divisions, fuel reserves, steel allocations. The numbers appear reassuring. Across the Atlantic, the United States feels distant. Industrial, yes, but slow, politically divided, protected by oceans. German generals read intelligence summaries that describe American factories as civilian, inefficient, unsuited for war. They see labour shortages, labour disputes. A nation not yet awake. To them, wars are decided by speed, by trained armies, by decisive blows at the front, not by assembly lines. No one in the room is talking about women. Not about shipyards on the Pacific coast. Not about aircraft plants in California or tank factories in Michigan. The assumption is quiet, almost invisible, that American society cannot transform itself fast enough to matter. Outside, snow falls on Berlin streets. Inside, confidence hardens into doctrine. The war ahead is imagined as one of manoeuvre and firepower, not production and endurance. But far beyond the reach of these maps, factory lights will soon stay on through the night, and when they do, the battlefield will quietly begin to shift, away from generals and toward machines, hands and time. The confidence inside German headquarters in early 1940 was not arrogance alone. It was rooted in experience. Germany had rebuilt its military power in less than a decade. Despite limited resources, political isolation, and the restrictions of Versailles, the Reich had achieved something that looked miraculous to outside observers. By 1939, it possessed a modern army, a disciplined officer corps, and a doctrine designed for rapid victory. Blitzkrieg was not simply a tactic, it was an answer to Germany's deepest weakness. Germany could not afford a long war. Its industrial base, though advanced, was constrained. Access to oil was limited. Rubber had to be synthesized. High-grade iron ore depended on imports from Sweden. Even before the war began, planners understood that prolonged attrition favored their enemies. Speed was essential. Decisive campaigns would compensate for material shortages. This belief shaped how German leaders viewed the world. France was expected to fall quickly. Britain was assumed to negotiate once isolated. The Soviet Union, in their calculations, would collapse under a short, violent campaign. And the United States, if it entered at all, would arrive late, burdened by distance and inefficiency. American industry was well known for its size, but size alone did not impress German planners. What mattered was readiness. In 1939, the US Army ranked far below European powers in strength. Its air force was small. Its tanks were outdated. Its population largely opposed involvement in another European war. Isolationism reinforced the illusion. German intelligence reports emphasized labor unrest in American factories during the 1930s. The Great Depression had left scars, idle plants, unemployment, political division. To German analysts, this suggested fragility. They saw a consumer economy, not a war economy, a society geared toward comfort, not sacrifice. Even when President Franklin Roosevelt began rearmament programs in 1939 and 1940, Berlin viewed them as symbolic. American democracy, they believed, would move slowly. Debates would delay decisions. Private companies would resist central control. Mobilization would be partial and uneven. This thinking was not limited to Hitler alone. Senior generals shared it. So did industrial planners. The German system was centralized, hierarchical, and controlled. Production was directed by ministries and military authorities. This structure had delivered rapid results in the 1930s, but it was rigid. Flexibility was limited. Scaling production required time Germany did not have. By contrast, American industry appeared chaotic from the outside. Thousands of independent firms. Civilian manufacturers with no apparent military experience. No tradition of total war mobilization since 1918. What German leaders failed to see was potential. They did not fully grasp the scale of American machine tool capacity. They underestimated the ability of civilian plants to convert to military output. Most critically, they misunderstood American labor reserves. Millions of able-bodied men would soon be drafted. That much was obvious. What was not obvious to Berlin was who would replace them. In Germany, women already worked in industry, but ideological constraints limited their use. Nazi doctrine emphasized motherhood over factory labor. Even as losses mounted, the regime hesitated to fully mobilize women until late in the war. American society had no such ideological barrier. By 1940, this difference remained theoretical. On paper, Germany still believed time was on its side. Victory would come before American industry could fully awaken. The war would be won by maneuver before production could tip the balance. That assumption would survive the fall of France. It would survive the Battle of Britain. It would even survive the first months after Pearl Harbor. But beneath the surface, the industrial balance was already beginning to change, and Germany had not yet realized that its greatest miscalculation lay not in strategy, but in society itself. December 7, 1941, shattered the remaining illusions of distance. Pearl Harbor transformed American rearmament into total mobilization. Within days, the war ceased to be theoretical. It became administrative, logistical, and industrial logistical. Washington moved with a speed that surprised even its own planners. On January 16, 1942, the War Production Board was created, consolidating authority over materials, contracts, and factory output. Civilian manufacturing was no longer optional, it was redirected. Automobile plants stopped making cars, refrigerators vanished from assembly lines. Typewriters, vacuum cleaners, and washing machines gave way to aircraft components, artillery shells, and armoured hulls. Entire industrial regions shifted purpose in a matter of months. Yet this transformation created an immediate problem. Men were leaving the modern years. By the end of 1942, millions of American men were in uniform or preparing to be. Shipyards, aircraft factories, and munitions plants faced an expanding workload with a shrinking workforce. Traditional labor pools could not fill the gap. Something more fundamental had to change. The solution was neither improvised nor accidental. It was planned. Federal agencies launched coordinated labor campaigns. Training programs were established in high schools, community colleges, and factory floors. Technical skills once reserved for experienced male workers were broken down, standardized, and taught at scale. And then women were recruited openly, systematically, and in unprecedented numbers. Posters appeared in cities and towns. Newspapers carried photographs of women operating drill presses, welding ship hulls, assembling aircraft engines. The message was direct. Industrial labor was patriotic service. Factory work became a form of enlistment. By mid-1943, over 6 million American women had entered industrial jobs connected to the war effort. Many had never worked outside the home. Others had held clerical or service positions. Now they were machinists, riveters, inspectors, crane operators. German intelligence noticed the posters. They saw the photographs, but they misread the meaning. To Berlin, these images suggested desperation, a stopgap, evidence that America lacked discipline. German planners assumed female labor would reduce efficiency, increase defects, and slow production. In their calculations, experience mattered more than numbers. The reality was different. American factories were reorganized around process, not tradition. Tasks were simplified, timed, and optimized. Precision came from standardization rather than individual craftsmanship. Women were not expected to adapt to old systems. The systems were rebuilt around mass participation. The results were measurable. Aircraft output climbed month after month. Ship launchings accelerated. Tank production exceeded projections. By 1944, American shipyards were launching a Liberty ship every few days. Aircraft plants produced bombers faster than German intelligence believed possible. This was not chaos. It was industrial mathematics. Germany, meanwhile, was straining. Allied bombing disrupted factories. Skilled male workers were pulled to the front. Women were still underutilized due to ideological resistance. Production increased, but never fast enough. The gap widened quietly, relentlessly. German generals still focused on battles. They still believed outcomes would be decided at the front. But behind every advancing Allied division stood a workforce that no longer resembled pre-war America. The war was no longer only about armies clashing across borders. It was about who could replace losses faster than they occurred. And at the center of that equation stood millions of women whose labor was reshaping the conflict in ways German planners had never fully calculated. The shift began quietly, without ceremony. Women arrived at factory gates before dawn. Some carried lunch pails. Others brought notebooks filled with training diagrams. Many had never touched industrial machinery before 1942. Within weeks, they were operating lathes, presses, and welding torches with practiced precision. This was not spontaneous heroism. It was organization. Training programs reduced complex processes into repeatable motions. Jigs and fixtures guided hands. Quality control relied on measurement, not intuition. Errors were identified early and corrected systematically. Productivity rose not because workers were stronger, but because the system was designed for scale. For many women, the work was exhausting. Shifts ran 10 to 12 hours. Noise, heat, and repetitive motion took a toll. Yet absenteeism remained low. Turnover stabilized. Factories adjusted schedules around childcare. Transportation was reorganized. The war economy absorbed social change rather than resisting it. German intelligence never fully understood this adaptation. They assumed morale would break, that women would abandon factory work once the novelty faded. Instead, output continued to rise. At the top, American leadership avoided micromanagement. The federal government set targets, allocated resources, and removed obstacles. Private firms executed. This hybrid system confused German planners accustomed to rigid control. They expected inefficiency. Instead, competition increased output. Companies shared designs. Patents were pooled. Production secrets were waived for speed. Women became integral to this process, not symbolic participants but core labor. Their numbers allowed expansion without sacrificing quality. Aircraft factories reached 3-shift operations. Shipyards worked around the clock. This was leadership by facilitation, not command. German generals noticed American production figures, but they doubted them. Intelligence officers suspected exaggeration. Reports conflicted with doctrine. How could inexperienced labor outperform trained European industries? How could women produce complex weapons at scale? The answer lay not in individual skill, but in industrial design, a concept German planners had undervalued. As American output surged, German confidence eroded slowly, reluctantly, and with each passing month, the numbers became harder to dismiss. By late 1943, the war's balance was shifting not through a single battle, but through accumulation, crate by crate, hull by hull, aircraft by aircraft. German industry prized precision engineering. American industry prized repeatability. This difference became decisive. In the United States, weapons were designed not only to perform, but to be produced in enormous numbers by a workforce that could be trained quickly. Components were standardized across factories. Aircraft parts built in California could fit airframes assembled in Kansas. Tanks rolled off lines with interchangeable systems. Repairs at the front became faster because parts were identical. Women were central to this system. They did not need years of apprenticeship. They needed consistency. Machines were calibrated. Tasks were simplified. Output was measured hourly, not artisan by artisan. German factories, by contrast, often relied on skilled specialists. Designs changed frequently. Variants multiplied. Precision remained high, but throughput suffered. Bombing amplified these weaknesses, disrupting specialized plants that could not easily relocate or duplicate output. American factories absorbed damage and expanded simultaneously. New plants opened even as others reached capacity. The system was elastic. By 1944, German generals were no longer debating whether American industry mattered. They were calculating how long they could survive it. Frontline reports described endless enemy material. Destroyed tanks were replaced within days. Downed aircraft were matched by new squadrons. Ammunition shortages plagued German units while Allied forces stockpiled reserves. Albert Speer later acknowledged the imbalance. German planners had underestimated not only American output, but its sustainability. They had assumed production surges would peak and decline. Instead, American industry maintained high levels month after month. The realization was corrosive. Every German success became temporary. Every victory cost resources that could not be replaced at the same rate. The psychological effect was cumulative, draining confidence even before defeat became inevitable. American women did not see the front lines, but they bore the war's weight in different ways. Injuries were common. Fatigue was constant. The pressure to meet quotas was unrelenting. Yet their contribution remained largely invisible in strategic calculations abroad. German doctrine had dismissed this kind of labour as secondary. It was a fatal oversight. The war was no longer decided by who fought better, but by who could endure longer. And endurance had become an industrial question. By the time German leaders fully understood the scale of American production, the machinery was already unstoppable. The imbalance had grown beyond correction. The war's turning point was approaching, not marked by a single explosion or surrender, but by a realization that the industrial race had already been lost. By 1943, the arithmetic of war had changed. Production charts inside Allied headquarters no longer tracked growth, they tracked distribution. The question was no longer how much could be built, but where it should be sent first. Europe, the Pacific, the Mediterranean. Multiple fronts were supplied simultaneously without collapse. For German commanders, this was the moment when optimism gave way to calculation. American aircraft output reached levels that defied pre-war assumptions. In 1944 alone, the United States produced nearly 100,000 military aircraft. Bombers, fighters, transports, assembled by workers who, only years earlier, had never entered a factory. Shipyards launched fleets faster than German U-boats could sink them. Tanks rolled out in numbers that rendered individual battlefield successes irrelevant. Behind these figures stood labour schedules filled by women working night shifts, rotating lines, maintaining precision under pressure. The industrial tempo never slowed. The decisive realization came not from propaganda, but from combat reports. German units in Italy and later in France began noting patterns. Destroyed Allied equipment was replaced almost immediately. Air superiority, once contested, became permanent. Even after heavy losses, Allied forces returned stronger. Normandy exposed the imbalance fully. In June 1944, the invasion forces were backed by a logistical network that had no historical precedent. Landing craft, vehicles, ammunition, fuel, all flowed continuously across the channel. Losses were absorbed without pause. German counterattacks met walls of steel that could not be worn down. Inside German headquarters, production reports grew increasingly grim. Bombing raids crippled plants faster than repairs could be made. Skilled labour was irreplaceable. Women were still underutilized, conscripted late and reluctantly. The contrast was stark. American factories expanded even under strain. German factories contracted under pressure. One system fed on momentum. The other bled from attrition. By late 1944, the war's outcome was no longer uncertain. It was delayed. German generals understood this, even as public rhetoric insisted otherwise. A turning point had passed not on a beach or in the sky, but months earlier, when American industry proved it could sustain maximum output indefinitely. And yet, the full consequences of this realization were still unfolding as battlefield events began to reflect the industrial truth behind them. As 1944 turned into 1945, the industrial imbalance translated into inevitability. German armies still fought with discipline. Tactical skill had not vanished, but every engagement now unfolded under conditions set by the enemy. Allied commanders could plan offensives knowing replacements were guaranteed. Equipment losses were accounted for before battles even began. In the air, the difference was absolute. German fighter pilots faced an enemy that returned in greater numbers after every encounter. Aircraft factories in the United States replaced entire squadrons faster than Germany could train pilots. Fuel shortages grounded planes that still existed on paper. By contrast, Allied air forces flew continuously, sustained by uninterrupted production. On the ground, the same pattern repeated. American armoured units accepted losses as part of operational planning. Tanks destroyed in 1 week were replaced the next. Ammunition expenditure, once a limiting factor, became a tactical choice rather than a constraint. Behind these operations stood an industrial engine still running at full capacity. Women continued to fill production lines even as victory approached. The system did not decelerate until the war ended. German leaders acknowledged the truth privately. Speer later admitted that the war had become unwinnable once Allied production surpassed German capacity by wide margins. The assumption that quality and skill could offset quantity collapsed under sustained pressure. The final offensives into Germany reflected this reality. Resistance slowed advances but could not reverse them. The war machine that had once moved with terrifying speed now lacked fuel, parts, and replacements. The decisive moment had not been a single battle. It had been the moment German generals realized that they were fighting an enemy whose strength did not diminish with time. And when time itself turned against them, the end became a matter of sequence, not possibility. What followed was not sudden collapse, but exhaustion, and the reckoning that comes when a nation's assumptions fail. The war in Europe ended not with surprise, but with depletion. By May 1945, German industry was shattered, rail networks lay broken, factories stood silent or in ruins. Fuel reserves were exhausted, skilled labour had been lost to the front, to bombing or to displacement. What remained could no longer sustain even defensive operations. Across the Atlantic, the contrast was stark. American factories were still operating at near-peak output when the fighting stopped. Assembly lines slowed only after orders were cancelled. Warehouses remained filled. Ships still crossed oceans loaded with material that was no longer needed. The imbalance had not merely won the war, it had defined its final shape. German officers taken prisoner commented repeatedly on the scale of Allied supply. Memoirs written after the war returned to the same theme. They had underestimated American capacity for industrial warfare, not just the machines, but the people behind them. Women were mentioned rarely in official German assessments during the war. Afterward, they appeared more often as a realization, not a prediction. The labour force Germany had hesitated to fully mobilize had become central to its defeat. In the United States, the transition was quieter. As soldiers returned, women were encouraged, often pressured, to leave factory jobs. Production lines retooled for civilian goods. Wartime posters came down. The industrial army dissolved without ceremony, yet the record remained. Aircraft totals, ship counts, tank production figures. They told a story that strategy alone could not explain. Victory had been manufactured long before the final shots were fired. The war had proven that modern conflict was no longer decided solely by generals or battlefields. It was decided by systems, by who could build, replace and sustain force over time. And that realization would shape every major military doctrine that followed. In the years that followed, German military analysis became reflective rather than defiant. Former commanders and planners revisited the assumptions made in the late 1930s. Many acknowledged that the focus on rapid victory had blinded them to the demands of total war. The belief that industrial potential could be overcome through speed alone proved flawed in a conflict without clear limits. Albert Speer's post-war writings were among the most candid. He described the failure to mobilize German society fully, particularly women, as a strategic error. Ideology had restricted labour at a moment when flexibility was essential. The delay could not be corrected once Allied bombing and battlefield losses compounded the problem. American industrial methods, once dismissed as inefficient, were now studied. The war had demonstrated that standardization, division of labour, and mass participation could outperform traditional craftsmanship under sustained pressure. Quantity had not replaced quality, but it had reshaped it. For American women, the aftermath was complex. Many returned to pre-war roles. Others carried industrial skills into new sectors. The cultural shift was partially reversed, but not erased. The experience had altered expectations, quietly, permanently. Globally, military planners took note. Future wars would be measured not only in divisions and aircraft, but in labour pools, production curves, and logistical depth. The battlefield had expanded beyond geography into society itself. German generals had underestimated this reality. They had prepared for a war of movement and shock. Instead, they faced a war of endurance and output. And endurance, once industrialized, became decisive. The consequences of that lesson would echo through the Cold War, shaping doctrines on both sides of the Atlantic. All that remained now was to reflect on what this miscalculation meant, not just for Germany or the United States, but for modern warfare itself. The Second World War did not end the age of generals. It ended the illusion that generals alone could decide wars. German commanders entered the conflict believing speed could overcome scarcity, that brilliance at the front could compensate for limits at home. For a time it seemed true, but the war they unleashed expanded beyond their calculations. drawing entire societies into its machinery. In the United States, that machinery was built deliberately. It was powered not only by steel and fuel, but by human adaptability. American women became part of the war not through ideology, but necessity. Their labor was not dramatic, but it was relentless. Hour after hour, shift after shift, they converted time into material advantage. German planners never fully adjusted to that reality. They underestimated a system that could absorb loss without collapse. They misjudged a society willing to reorganize itself at scale, and by the time the consequences were undeniable, the industrial balance had already sealed the outcome. This was not a story of inevitability, Harry. It was a story of assumptions and what happens when they fail. Modern warfare, as revealed by this conflict, is fought long before the first shot is fired. It is fought in factories, in labour policies, in decisions about who is allowed to contribute and how quickly a society can change. The war was decided not only by courage at the front, but by endurance behind it. And in that quiet, continuous effort, history turned one machine, one shift, one worker at a time.